Story 1. The Factory of Whispers. Jake, Emily, and Mark were thrill seekers, always looking for new places to explore. When they heard about an abandoned factory on the outskirts of their town, it seemed like the perfect adventure. The building had been closed down for decades, rumored to be cursed after a series of fatal accidents. But none of them believed in curses. They were more interested in finding old equipment, forgotten relics, and maybe even a hidden room or two. The trio arrived at the factory just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the rusted machinery and crumbling walls. The entrance was sealed with heavy iron gates, but after a bit of searching, they found a hole in the fence big enough to crawl through. Inside, the factory was eerily silent. Massive machines lay dormant, covered in layers of dust, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. As they moved deeper into the building, Jake pointed out faded safety posters and remnants of what looked like workers' uniforms strewn across the floor. "This place is so creepy," Emily muttered, shining her flashlight into the darkened corners. They reached the central hall, where towering machines loomed over them like mechanical giants. As Mark was about to suggest heading further into the factory, they heard it, a faint whisper. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. "I did," Emily whispered back. The three stood frozen, listening as the whispers seemed to form words, unintelligible at first but growing clearer by the second. It sounded like someone or something was pleading for help. Without warning, the lights in the factory flickered on. The machines roared to life with an ear-splitting screech, as though they were waking from a long slumber. Panic surged through the group. "We need to get out of here," Mark yelled over the cacophony. As they turned to run, the whispers became screams echoing through the cavernous halls. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, seemed to move in the corners of their vision, darting behind the machinery. Jake tripped, falling hard onto the concrete floor, and when Emily rushed to help him up, she saw the look of sheer terror on his face. "I saw them," Jake gasped, his voice shaking. "The workers. They're still here." The three bolted for the exit, the screams growing louder, more desperate. Just as they reached the hole in the fence, the lights cut out again, plunging the factory into darkness. But even outside, the whispers followed them, faint but persistent, as though the ghosts of the factory's past were still crying out for help. They never returned to the factory, but the whispers stayed with them. Late at night, when everything was quiet, they would hear it. A soft, mournful voice echoing in their ears, a reminder of the souls trapped in that decaying building, forever seeking release. Story 2. The Hospital That Time Forgot. In the mountains of West Virginia, there was an old hospital, long abandoned and forgotten by time. It was once a tuberculosis sanatorium, where patients were sent to die in the early 1900s. Legend had it that many of the doctors were more interested in experimenting on their patients than curing them, performing cruel and inhumane treatments that led to countless deaths. Ryan, a paranormal investigator, had heard about the hospital from a local who swore it was haunted. The building had been left untouched for over 70 years, its walls crumbling and its windows broken. But Ryan was not one to shy away from a challenge. Armed with his camera, a digital recorder, and a flashlight, he set out to explore the hospital in hopes of capturing evidence of the supernatural. The hospital loomed before him like a giant tomb, its darkened windows staring out like empty eyes. The wind howled through the trees, but Ryan pushed open the rusted doors and stepped inside. The smell of mold and decay hit him immediately, and the silence was oppressive. As he made his way through the narrow hallways, he passed rusted hospital beds, decaying medical equipment, and cabinets filled with dusty bottles of forgotten medicine. He stopped in front of a set of double doors, which led to the operating theater. His heart raced as he pushed the doors open, revealing a large room with a single operating table in the center. The walls were lined with surgical tools, long since abandoned, but their sharp edges still glinted in the dim light of his flashlight. As Ryan raised his camera to take a picture, he heard it, a faint tapping sound like footsteps. He froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, echoing through the halls. Ryan's pulse quickened. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response, but the tapping continued, coming closer and closer. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and Ryan could see his breath in the air. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Panic surged through him. He pulled at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping was right outside now, just on the other side of the door. Ryan backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He aimed his camera toward the door, hoping to capture something, anything. That's when he saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, slipped through the crack beneath the door and slithered toward him. It moved unnaturally, like smoke twisting through the air, but there was a palpable sense of malevolence in its presence. Ryan stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. The shadow took form, a figure in a doctor's coat, but with hollow, empty eye sockets and a twisted grin on its face. It reached out toward Ryan with bony fingers, its grin widening as it whispered, "You're next." With a scream, Ryan bolted for the other side of the room, where he found an old window partially boarded up. He smashed through it, cutting his arms and legs in the process, but he didn't care. All he wanted was to escape the nightmare he had walked into. Ryan never returned to the hospital, but he later discovered that several investigators who had ventured there before him had all experienced similar encounters, each one chased out by the malevolent spirit of the doctor, still searching for his next patient. Story 3. The House on Blackthorn Road. In the small town of Ravenwood, there was a house that no one dared to enter. It sat at the end of Blackthorn Road, shrouded in mist and covered in vines, its windows broken and its roof sagging. The locals whispered that the house was cursed, and that anyone who entered would never be the same again. Sarah and her friends didn't believe in curses. They were bored teenagers looking for a thrill, and the abandoned house seemed like the perfect place to explore on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Armed with flashlights and a couple of snacks, they made their way down Blackthorn Road, laughing and joking as they approached the house. The door was unlocked, and it creaked open with an eerie groan. The interior was just as they had imagined, dusty furniture, cobwebs, and a sense of stillness that felt unnatural. "This is awesome," Sarah said, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. They explored the first floor without incident, finding nothing more than old photographs and forgotten trinkets. But when they reached the second floor, things began to change. The air grew colder, and the house seemed to groan under their weight, as though it were alive and watching them. In one of the bedrooms, Sarah found a mirror, old and cracked, with strange symbols carved into its frame. As she wiped away the dust, something caught her eye, a figure standing behind her in the reflection. She spun around, but the room was empty. "Did you see that?" she whispered to her friends. But they hadn't seen anything. The figure appeared again in the reflection, this time closer, its face obscured by shadows. Sarah backed away from the mirror, her heart racing. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. But the house had other plans. The door to the bedroom slammed shut, trapping them inside. The lights in their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Sarah heard a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, as though something was circling them. They screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't open. The footsteps grew closer, and Sarah felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. A voice, barely a whisper, said, "You shouldn't have come here." The door finally flew open, and the group bolted down the stairs, running for their lives. They didn't stop until they were far away from the house, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. None of them spoke about what happened that day, but they all knew one thing for sure. Whatever haunted that house on Blackthorn Road was still there, waiting for its next victim, and they had barely escaped with their lives.